It is more about technological and economic mobilization as a guarantee of the continuous process of ensuring and maintaining technological superiority over enemy. Today, robots not only perform auxiliary functions, but also carry out separate assault operations and even take live enemy soldiers prisoner. The use of any technology in these skills zones as well as people has become a real suicide mission. So the conclusion is about demographics and war. The Russian-Ukrainian war has taught countries with demographic challenges a critically important lesson. The model of warfare that involves trading human lives for tactical gains is no longer a logical and viable option. Except for Russia, also any resource is exhausted for Russia as well.
Насиченими високоточними засобами ураження, такий підхід є неприйнятним не тільки з моральної точки зору.
On a modern high-tech battlefield saturated with precision weapon systems, this model is unacceptable not only on moral grounds, but on those of tactical efficiency. Paradoxically, as the technological sophistication of the battlefield increases, the human resources become the scarcest, maybe the only fundamentally non-renewable resource of all. This is especially true for developed countries, where the demographic trends render traditional approaches to warfare less and less acceptable. For example, on the European continent, there is not a single country with a positive birth rate, so the loss of manpower on the battlefield would have huge socio-economic rather than mere military implications. Therefore, technological evolution towards the robotization of warfare has offered an alternative that allows for the preservation of combat effectiveness while radically reducing human involvement and, as a result, human losses. The ultra-expensive precision weapons that were a real game changer in the 20th century have been replaced by weapons of attrition. These are cheap and mass-produced but highly accurate weapons that deplete at a high rate expensive weapon systems, on the use of which, by the way, the NATO doctrine relies. These weapons of attrition are being developed consistently and effectively. No country can cope with such a challenge on its own, especially if they choose to err on the side of caution. This calls into question the ability of even resource-rich countries to wage long wars against smaller ones. Nor is it possible to build an effective and efficient defense using the old approaches, even if resources are available. For example, the war in Ukraine has shown that it makes little difference how many combat-ready frigates, corvettes, submarines, and even missile cruisers you have. This advantage can be nullified by a country whose navy was destroyed at the beginning of the war. And let's be honest, who's really controlling the Black Sea now? Summing up, procurement of expensive and unique products would not guarantee security in the era of modern warfare. A most important consideration, success in a high-intensity war of attrition with the deployment of cheaper and more efficient means of attack depends on the resilience of the nation's economy and its ability to ensure uninterrupted power supplies. We will get back to this later. Simply put, it's about the ability to maintain military potential over time in the face of constant tensions, complex logistics, and accelerated technological change. It is the economy combined with political and social preparedness that becomes the lifeblood of war. And it is the main target of the belligerent parties. How can we make sure that the economy contributes to the victory? There are two stages of economic development in a country at war. First, the economy should be put on a war footing, mobilized mobilized, and then it should be persistently fueled. This is the greatest challenge for Ukraine today. What does it mean to mobilize or to put the economy on a war footing? It's simple. A series of measures should be taken so that military-industrial planning becomes part and parcel of the planning of military operations and does not depend on external supplies. Do we see this happening in Russia? Yes, we do. There is every indication that the Russian economy has been put on a footing as part of their public policy. We experience the consequences of this move every day and every night. It is almost impossible to stop such a military steamroller. The only option is to destroy it. That is why every war so far has inevitably led to an arms race. More about the economy. I can assure you that traditional defense industrial models, that is, centralized factories, long supply chains, the rigid production cycle, are no longer fit for purpose. Not only do they generate a lot of critical vulnerabilities, but they also fail to adjust timely to actual operational conditions. Now, the brutal war of attrition in Ukraine is a war against economic opportunities. So far, the weakest link in the economy has been the energy sector. Ukraine's energy infrastructure has traditionally been built on a centralized model, large power plants and a single grid connecting the regions. This war has exposed vulnerability of such a system to targeted attacks. Over the 4 years of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, attacks on power plants and grids have become the main instrument of war. The aggressor's goal has been to cut off power supply to cities. By the end of 2024, up to 80% of the thermal power plants' capacity in Ukraine was out of commission, and energy transmission to the population was halved. As a result, in the winter of 2026, millions of people have been left without heating and electricity. Centralized facilities like large thermal power plants, hydro and even nuclear power plants, extended electricity grids become an Achilles heel of the national security in the times of war. If the enemy destroys several key nodes, entire regions are plunged into darkness. Thus, the energy security is inextricably linked not only to the resilience of the wartime economy, but also to the national security. Protecting energy facilities becomes as important as protecting territories. To fully understand the current situation, it's necessary to dwell on some other aspects. First of all, what about the nuclear weapons? In my humble opinion, I know it will be criticized. Today, this super powerful weapon is akin to a fig leaf on Atlas's body. It disguises the true capabilities of the one who possesses it. It only tells you there should be something behind it, but it does not reveal the real capabilities. It is, first and foremost, a weapon of self-destruction, not a weapon of deterrence. Look at the Zaporizhia NPP, for example, which has become a hostage to economic and political pressure rather than a clear and present danger that it really is. The next aspect is missiles. They remained in active use despite their high cost of production. However, their function has transformed from a purely combat tool at the front line to a means of the so-called missile terror, striking civilian quarters and the state's critical infrastructure, destroying its economic potential. This type of weapon is likely to remain the most expensive one in a war of attrition, not only because it is costly to manufacture, but also because at this stage there are no defense solutions other than anti-missile and missile systems, which are even more expensive than the missiles themselves. Missiles are yet another weapon to threat the state. That's obvious. On the other hand, they are manufactured in certain limited numbers, allowing for more or less accurate assessment of the air defense needs. This, coupled with the right tactics of using the available air defense systems, can limit the effect of attrition. Should we have such missiles in sufficient quantities, the enemy will have to spend much more on expensive air defense systems, thus increasing the price of war for their economy. That is why some people seem to have concerns about Ukraine's having such weapons. Yet, our asset to this capability could be instrumental in our victory, as well as part of the forgotten theory of non-nuclear deterrence. For us to have a full picture, I will specifically comment on the role of aviation in this war. The Russian airspace forces are the second most powerful in the world, second only to those of the United States. In terms of the total number of combat aircraft, Russia has a huge advantage over Ukraine. However, Russian planes rarely venture deep into Ukrainian territory for fear of being shot down by the Western-made air defense systems. Classic air battles are also rare in this war, mostly because of the pertinent costs. For example, a fourth-generation Su-30 fighter jet costs about $50 million and can be easily shot down by a $4.5 million Patriot missile. This simple arithmetic shows that the aircraft could hardly be a weapon of attrition, but as a platform for launching other weapons of attrition, it is quite effective. So today, the combat planes serve as a platform for striking ground targets with weapons of attrition and as carriers of air defense systems, never going within the range of the enemy's air defense. One can state with confidence that manned aircraft have got their own kill zone and that the personnel are increasingly moving away from this zone. Such a situation in the skies enables operations aiming to break through the enemy's air defense by depleting it with other means. Of course, this will require resources. This describes, in general terms, the changes that have taken place since the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War, the largest conflict in Europe since World War II. I would like to reiterate that technical and technological progress has resulted in a profound transformation of all domains, sea, air, land, outer space, cyber, which continue to be rapidly transformed through the advance of AI. This process has fundamentally changed the role of traditional weapon systems and has undoubtedly affected not only the nature of warfare, but also the procedures for training, organization, and development of defense capabilities. All of this urges the military strategies, tactics, and operational prowess to adapt. It is the emergence of new technological solutions that leads to the most revolutionary changes in the conduct of hostilities. In the past, it was gunpowder, aircraft, or nuclear weapons. Today, it's unmanned or uncrewed systems and AI. So, talking about the war of the future, we have to admit that the militech revolution based on unmanned systems and AI provides unprecedented tools for war and destruction of the enemy's military and economic potential. And one can see the main trends in the development of these technologies. The key functions that are constantly evolving, including through the introduction of AI, and they, attention, pose a real threat, are A, the swarming function, and B, the autonomy function. Simply put, in the near future, with the development of the resource-based and hardware, we will see smarter and cheaper drones attacking by the dozens or even hundreds from different directions and altitudes, simultaneously from the air, ground, and water. The autonomy of these drones will develop in two main directions, either in a single centralized digital space, in a common system of real-time control and interaction, where all actions and processes are still controlled by humans, albeit with the help of AI. Alternatively, it will be drone to fully autonomous robotic complexes swarms, both in combat and support functions. Such drones will be endowed with a high level of individual AI that learns and develops in real time within the limits necessary to perform combat missions, and will not require constant communication with each other or with command nodes to carry out their missions. This is, in fact, a transfer of responsibility to a separate tactical system, a drone. Another option is a combination of these basic architectures, whereby the advantages of the network are used whenever possible, and the system goes into the autonomous darkness when there is no other choice.
Then, logistically, the most pressing task for those who need long-term security guarantees is, among other things, to work on improving swarm intelligence algorithms on the one hand, and to find ways to combat and counteract drone swarms on the other. Naturally, the laboratory itself, where all this is currently being tested, is located in Ukraine. Let me remind you that on the night of the 6th to 7th of September 2025, Kyiv was attacked simultaneously by 862 Shahed-type kamikaze drones. So whether we agree or not, the war of the future will be a war of autonomous and semi-autonomous robotic systems. It is clear that the competition to use the full potential of autonomous swarm UAVs will provide a decisive advantage, likely to provide a decisive advantage in both immediate combat effectiveness and security guarantees. Of course, the prospects for developing drone swarm technologies, ground, surface, and underwater in Ukraine must be considered in light of the critical dependence on global microelectronic supply chains. Therefore, future security alliances will likely be built on the principle of resource security. Unfortunately, for Ukraine, the development of relevant national capabilities is impossible without the full implementation of a sustainable partnership and the introduction of appropriate policies in the field of military digital products and services. From a technological point of view, the Russian-Ukrainian war is currently in a transitional period. This is a period when technology is developing rapidly, but its development is still insufficient to, for example, completely eliminate human presence in the combat zone or ensure the complete autonomy of unmanned systems. However, it has been impossible to carry out the operational tasks of a classic war for more than 2 years. Traditional weapons and structures are still being used, but are gradually being phased out or transformed. With Russia unable to achieve its political goals in the war and Ukraine refusing to surrender, Russia is stepping up its attacks on infrastructure, energy systems, transport hubs, and other key elements of state administration and life support. Therefore, the strategy of the war is now aimed not so much at capturing territory, as at depleting the enemy's resources and capabilities in order to achieve its goals. All this is happening against the backdrop of the expected destabilization of the disbalancing of old world order. This is also exacerbated exacerbated by the US policy of non-compliance with the international legal framework, which would lead to the ultimate destruction of the existing international system, a system, by the way, that could purely theoretically take measures against the aggressor country and serve as a future basis, for example, for a peace treaty. Among other things, these steps by the US are exacerbating contradictions within NATO and leading to a decline in both the real effectiveness of the alliance and most importantly, coordinated assistance to Ukraine. Russia, meanwhile, is exploiting the situation to reduce sanctions, expand its military-industrial complex, accumulate the necessary technology, and obtain additional support from China. By inviting Ukraine to negotiations, it is starting a war on a much higher strategic level, a war against women, children, and the elderly, sparing neither expensive missiles nor Shaheeds, suicide bombers, forcing them to freeze in cold cities, hoping for a quick surrender. In such a situation when the tension and intensity of the war of attrition is increasing, it is of course necessary to find a solution that would not only not harm the current geopolitical situation, but will also become the basis for future peace based on the strength of potential opportunities, not obligations. Such a solution may include the implementation of three parallel tasks. The first and most difficult task is to preserve the maximum number of partners and respect their interests, without which it is impossible today to withstand Russian attacks, exert pressure, and effectively build a future defense alliance without harming future allies. This is a delicate and balanced diplomatic effort, which had no parallel in world history due to the completely unprecedented conditions in which all participants in this process find themselves, because the old rules no longer work, but people still have high hopes on them, and the new ones have not yet even been formulated yet. And when that will happen and in what time frame is unknown. Personally, for me, the main condition for this process is the preservation of democracy and freedom and the standard of living, which is the main achievement, for example, of Europe. At the same time, there's a great risk of coming to situational agreements, cynical arrangements, and short-term interest without any common framework. However, this must be done, because it is the lessons of this war that speak of the need to join forces to create defense capabilities. This war, as well as an analysis of the current development of the military capabilities of the world's leading countries, demonstrate the following. Individual states will be able to independently create technological superiority in certain areas, but no state will be able to ensure self-sufficiency across the entire spectrum of critical military technologies. Therefore, the search for alliances and partnerships for joint development and exchange of advanced technologies and strengthening of production capacities will become an absolute necessity, not only for us, but also for countries seeking to ensure their own technological superiority and competitive capabilities in potential conflicts. Of course, I'm talking about Europe, where Russia will remain a source of danger for an indefinite period. We will need technological alliances, not treaty articles, where countries will combine their resources, technologies, and innovative potential with ours to achieve a common strategic advantage, and as a result, gain potential power. The second crucial task is to stabilize the line of combat and protect critical facilities and infrastructure. This is our homework. Achieving technical successes, even at the cost of high losses of manpower and energy terror, is the main subject, on the one hand, of pressure on those who can influence, if not the end of the war, but then at least the lifting of sanctions, and our support and intimidation of future partners on the other. When it becomes clear that this is a war of attrition, where the main goal is economic survival, it is necessary to move away from the classic strategy of inflicting maximum damage and consistently defeating the enemy. In addition, probably due to the impossibility of improving mobilization and demographic disparities with Russia, the only strategy is not a symmetrical response and following the enemy's logic, but rather changing the very nature of the war. We need to make the war more costly for Russia, and as a result, lead to its inevitable defeat. Then it is obvious that today the task of stabilizing the line of contact is only possible through maximum technological advancement of defense. But the transition to high-tech defense is only possible if there are stable defensive positions. If these positions are located on unfavorable lines and the front line is unstable, this can negate the advantages of technological superiority. For example, due to the dispersion of efforts to eliminate technical breakthroughs, stable defensive positions can also reduce the stress and fatigue for those who are there, and as well as allow for the preparation of necessary reserves and the scaling of optimal technological solutions. It is also important to understand that all this must necessarily be accompanied by the acquisition of the necessary managerial discipline, which will provide the necessary advantage. That is why Russia constantly uses tactics of infiltration and control of area areas, not only to capture additional territories, but also to prevent us from intercepting the technological initiative. The situation is the same with the protection of critical infrastructure. The problem is not even that more air defense and innovative solutions are needed to protect it, but that the system, for example, energy supply can no longer exist and to be defended in the form in which it was created in the 1950s. In such conditions, it is probably necessary to pay more attention to the strategy of decentralizing energy as a way to increase the country's resilience to any attacks. It is military action and its consequences that made this concept urgent. Decentralization went from being a question of efficiency to a question of national survival. Energy decentralization involves a transition from a few large energy sources to many small ones distributed across the territory. This is the implementation of the concept of distributed generation, where electricity and heat are produced closer to the consumer at local low-capacity power plants, renewable power plants, and micro and mini-grids. It is precisely this architecture that will significantly increase the resilience of the energy system in the face of the threat of weapons of attrition. This is an extremely complex process, but it is obvious and predictable, unlike promises not to destroy such a system or to produce more air defense systems. Presumably, the reconstruction process should begin now, without waiting for a peace deal, which may never happen, and a new format of peacekeepers should be launched who do not fight but rebuild. The main conclusion is that the energy system has become a new front in the war, and its stability determines the outcome of the conflict. The transition from the Soviet centralized network to a modern decentralized hybrid system is not only a modernization, but also the country's ability to survive and therefore to win. In any case, the preservation and protection of critical infrastructure must be based on real rather than expected and uncontrollable capabilities. The third task is to convince our partners of the need to impose tangible sanctions and not to ease the sanctions regime against Russia. In a war of attrition, this is the only effective mechanism for ending the war, which consists in depriving the aggressor of the very possibility of waging war. Russia's recent activity in the United States and the intensified terror on our cities testify to tangible problems in the Russian economy. This is a real signal coming from within the Russian state apparatus. The deterioration of the economic situation and the threat of citizens dying in war are gradually creating a fundamentally different situation in terms of Russia's perception of the ruling regime and calling into question the stability of the entire totalitarian regime. It was precisely such an explosion of an economic crisis that once forced the Soviet Union to end the war in Afghanistan and led to a phase of loss of control within the Soviet Union itself. The military economy, filled with huge expenditures on defense orders and payments to mercenaries, must be approaching a breaking point. It is very important for us to continue to strike at the sources of Russian income in parallel with the financial support of our partners. Among the main measures should be a reduction in purchases of Russian energy resources and the fight against the shadow fleet, especially in the Baltic Sea. Of course, Russia will have money for the war until the very end. However, it is important to understand that restrictions on its economic capabilities and isolation must be irreversible and the only thing that can lead to the end of the war. Any war is another mistake of humanity and a huge tragedy. And also the causes of the war are easy to identify and always understandable. Its consequences are completely unpredictable. Every war is unique in its own way. Each of them has always required its own unique strategy. However, the only thing that unites all wars in their essence is their essence. They're always an act of violence, and they always end. It is precisely because of its essence, because of its violence, that humanity, guided by the instinct of self-preservation, has always tried to end wars and has ended them. Even the 100 Years' War, which lasted almost 116 years, ended. It is obvious that the war, which has been going on for 13 years in Ukraine, must end. This is an inevitable process that must finalize and consolidate the achievement of the political goals of the warring parties. It is important to note that human suffering in continuous conscious violence has almost never ended. Wars, not always in history, but to be precise, with a few exceptions, has anyone managed to achieve their goals. Therefore, each side, each party has the right to justify its losses and only its own historical justice. And this is what sometimes prompts more and more participants to go to war. And therefore, wars eventually become not only long, but also global. Now, same way, now, in an attempt to satisfy the appetites of yet another aggressor, the world is on the brink of another war, the outcome of which is completely unknown. Therefore, the international community has its choice, either to become the Munich traitors of the 21st century and accept all the sufferings of the war, or stop the war in such a way in order to avoid another one. It is not yet necessary to send their soldiers to war. So it's sufficient for our friends to demonstrate their will and demonstrate their attitudes to that for example, the latest news that the participants of this, those supporting killers of our children will participate in Paralympics. This sport as if is outside the politics. We Ukrainians no longer have a choice. We will either perish or survive. The formula for survival is simple: to continue fighting, strengthen the economy, and maintain unity.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. I mean, you covered a fascinating range of issues there, from the technological evolution of warfare on the front line, the infrastructure attacks, the effect on society, and how we should respond to modern warfare. And I'm sure that those are themes that will be picked up in the questions. I'm not going to ask you the personal political questions that you asked us not to raise, but I can't promise that others won't. We don't have a great deal of time, so I'm just going to go straight, if I may, to one question that came in online, and then I'll open up in the room. And actually, the question online picks up where you left off, because you said in your speech, in the end, all wars end. But you didn't say how this war is going to end. And the question is, could you say a bit more about how you foresee the possibility of a ceasefire and eventually an end of the conflict? And if I could add to that, how seriously and how should we evaluate the American efforts at negotiation that we've seen various waves of? Do you think that they are likely to lead to progress, particularly in the context of demands being made on Ukraine to surrender territory that has not been taken by military force?
Дуже гарне і дуже актуальне запитання.
Very legitimate question, I would say. In order to answer that, I would start with the following. Let us be frank and admit that since December 2023, that hasn't been a conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, but it has been a global problem. For example, let us look at the number of the countries introducing sanctions, introducing secondary stage sanctions, the number of those who support the Russian Federation. Let us be frank, that's a global issue, and it needs global solutions. Global solutions, what does it mean? It means that such solutions should not allow in a distant or near future, for Ukraine, say, for the next 100 years, for the Russian Federation to start the war again, nor should it allow Russia to end this war at the stage where Ukraine suffers from the collapse, Russia suffers from the collapse, and our nearest neighbors also suffer from collapse. We need global solutions and decisions. Who can take such decisions? These are global actors of the global geopolitics, which is based on the world order, the current world order. And the problem is that this global world order is crumbling as a result of many factors, including our war. So we see that the global actors cannot actually come up with such decisions. Global actors, many of them have nuclear weapons, but they don't have the soldiers prepared to fight at the front line. They have got resources, but they can't develop sufficient amount of weapons. So how can they impact the situation? They should develop their economies that would underlie their defense capacities and capabilities. So this is a global issue. Of course, Ukraine would not agree to any capitulation. It will not accept any capitulation. Will Europe be prepared to repeat what happened back in 1938 in Munich? You remember what it led to for Europe and for the US. So in order to address this global issue, we have to get the global environment formed with realistic global assessment of the state of play in Russia, for example, and what is needed to get Russia stop the war, end the war for economic reasons. Of course, we have an opportunity now to isolate Russia, to put it under economic pressure, and to keep the front line We should not allow the situation at the front line impact the negotiations on the peace deal. It is extremely important to appreciate the significance of the moment. We should be thinking of a solution that would not be taken by the old-style or old-school politicians. Do we really have people, politicians, decision-makers capable of looking ahead, say, for 20 years, understanding how to build their economies so that the next war is effectively avoided? I don't know. But we all see that the war can be ended right now, but it would not be enough. If the war ends, but no new security system is put in place, it will bring about the new war. So technologies are a key. Any country with sufficient technologies can become an aggressor. And in the war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, technologies are a complicated issue.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to the room here. I'm going to take two questions, and I think probably that's all I'm afraid we're going to have time for, but I'll take one over here. James Lansdale, why don't you come in? And I'll take one over this side of the room, that lady there with a hand up. Can we take two questions at the same time? Yeah?
Dobry den, General. James Landale, BBC News. Do you wish one day to be president of Ukraine?
I told you.
And secondly, if you were president now, what would you do differently? Dziękuję.
That's the first question. Second question from a lady over here. You've got a mic, yes. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Diana. I'm the president of Cambridge University Ukrainian Society. And my question is about information. So, General Zaluzhnyi, you've mentioned a lot of type of weapons today. Do you consider information another type of weapon that is used in the war today? And what's your attitude to the concept of informational war? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll do those two questions. If we can come back for more, we will. Ambassador. Your personal ambitions.
Now, in order to answer this question, I should go to one of the wonderful pubs in this very city and discuss it there. It's pub talk, actually, or bar talk. It's bad when the questions of Ukraine's internal policies go to the international level. It shouldn't be. This should be tabooed. I have spoken about it on numerous occasions. In order to answer the first question of the esteemed BBC correspondent, we should at least understand how the situation can resolve. And as matters stand, nothing gives me even a slightest chance to think about what happens after the war. When it is over, when the martial law is lifted in Ukraine, and you start thinking about what martial law is about, it's a very unusual state of affairs, and the martial law will be lifted once we reconstruct our country. Only then will we be able to discuss my personal future. Quite recently, we conducted a study of the situation in Ukraine with several think tanks and my friends, and we observed terrible things on the ground, in the air, and in the water. Robots are capable of taking their own decisions. So when we speak about yet another domain that is information, we have to admit that we are living in the times of information warfare. Very soon we will be speaking about this cyber domain rather than information domain, because today a group of people can create content for $20 to $30 and they can be successful. But the situation is rapidly changing because today AI can do that. 2 days from now, it will be only AI to generate such content. That's why I spoke about different domains like air, water, ground, outer space, and cyber. And then we won't be able to overcome fakes if we close down, for example, a certain messenger or information portal, because neural networks will have incredible power. And this is a totally new domain for warfare.
Thank you. I think we've got time for 2 more very quick questions, if that's okay with you.
No problem.
Go fast. So
I'm
I'll come
ready.
over this side again. Gentleman there with a hand up. And then this side, someone at the back maybe. I need to be democratic here. Okay, there's a gentleman at the back there as well.
Ambassador, hi, it's Matthias Gebauer, German magazine Der Spiegel. It's probably no surprise to you that I ask a question about the attack on Nord Stream 2. There are a lot of rumors in the last couple of months, and I'm sure you followed the investigation. There are a few Ukrainians already in custody, being indicted for planning and conducting this attack. Were you somehow informed about the plans of this team beforehand?
Okay, thank you very much. A specific question about that, and gentleman there.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that very interesting speech, especially about energy and technology. Oh, I'm sorry. My name's James Lapushner. I own an investment management firm. Only 2 countries really control AI, and that's America and China. Is it possible for countries like Ukraine and Russia to independently develop their own AI, swarm technology, and autonomy without relying on either of those countries?
Thank you, Ambassador. We've got a minute or so left.
Прекрасні два питання.
All excellent, fantastic 2 questions. Coming back to Germany, to Spiegel, first of all, I would like to thank the German government and the German people for the support for Ukraine. This is a unique example, case in the history of humankind, what it means to work on mistakes and what it means to protect your own and others' lives. Thank you very much. In terms of the Nord Stream situation, finally, it's this question has become public, and I myself had nothing to do with it. And in order to prevent the situation, it turned out to be in 2019 in Brussels when I was arrested at the airport. There's a war criminal. Naturally, I sent many requests and to German prosecutor's office. I understand all the details, but the German prosecutors are they are not obliged to inform me. But I am concerned that I cannot be directly or indirectly be involved in this process. Somehow, this process has moved way out from the legal criminal aspect, moved into more political dimension. Perhaps you also were, as myself, that Nord Stream and Germany has nothing to do to each other. The Nord Stream is the Gazprom property. And then my question is, why the German government is so preoccupied with the Russian property? And on top of that, the government of Germany on many occasions and stated that it was a mistake, and more than that, and they don't really see any political necessity in it. Together with that, well, let's, if we analyze the situation deeper, that currently what I see that this is the fight for insurance payments has started, and this acquiring more impulse and getting others involved. But I do believe in European legal system, justice system, and irrespective of the fact that some people are arrested and under arrest, we're moving towards the European standards. And I'm not going to assess the the actions of the law enforcement agencies, but this process should be fair. And once again, I will repeat myself, I'm not involved either is a good thing or bad thing, but let you make conclusions. And then there's very interesting questions in terms of the AI, artificial intelligence. Look, one can be so proud in any country, in any nation, of the achievements, claiming that we're developing in the field of artificial intelligence. It's possible to say this and do good presentations and do different conferences. I will tell you, the laboratory where all these things can be tested, the combat system which tests the AI is located, unfortunately, where it is located now. There are no things you were mentioning. This, what they're testing there, it's completely different things. But I believe that currently these, the activities, the work in its area of AI will depend obviously on the resource base, which, as everybody knows, in the countries which you listed, there are not so many of them, those who are capable to do it on a mass scale. That is, the resource base will be one of the indicators of this development and progress, and naturally the software and hardware developments, those capable to develop this kind of architecture that is in the development and designing those codes and software necessary will most likely the United States have them. But whether in a practical terms, whether the processing and testing, it's difficult to say that. Myself personally, I haven't seen these systems in Ukraine so far. Perhaps we'll see them a bit sooner.
Well,
that's the answer.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us today and marking this very important moment, sad moment in the history of your country. I just want to say there were many things that we could have discussed, but to thank you and to express our support for the President, government, army and people of Ukraine on behalf of Chatham House. Thank you very much.
Thank you.